Hello, and thanks for joining us for our GDPR webinar. Client compliance is clearly a big concern for many, so this is actually our highest attendance of the year so far. And I'm pleased to say our invited speaker, Tim Rowe of RedEye. I've been working reviewing the deck of guidance with Tim, and I'm pleased to say it's got clear guidance, and I think it's actually reassuring. So hopefully you'll be able to pick up some advice that you can follow up on. I'm also pleased to say that Tim's referencing the e-privacy initiative that some of you may know as PCR, the Privacy and Communications Regulations, because a lot of what's written about GDPR fails to mention that. And in terms of web communications, cookies, and email marketing communications, which I know many of you are important to you, those often aren't mentioned when people are commentating on GDPR. So do watch out for what Tim says about e-privacy. Just before we start, I think it's I hope you agree with me that it's generally, I think marketers are happy to see this focus with GDPR because it encourages us to be more customer-centric, and it makes our marketing activities, our comms, more transparent. And it addresses consumer concerns about privacy, which we've seen through the recent Facebook testimony of Mark Zuckerberg to Congress. But having said that, I think most of us would agree it's a good thing, but we're concerned how far we need to go, because there is a commercial risk that if you're reconsenting, which is another word to watch out for, there is a risk that you will lose many people who you're currently communicating through email, and that may affect your commercial returns. Just this morning, I received an email from a well-known hotel chain, I'll say, I won't name and shame them, and it was offering me to opt into their communications. And actually, I'm already a member of their loyalty program, and by sending that email, let's say 20% of people open on it, maybe 10% click on it, they're potentially going to lose 90% of their audience, and I'm not sure that was actually necessary in that case. So we'll talk more about reconsent and e-privacy, but Tim is going to major on the GDPR compliance. So before I hand over to Tim, we'll have many Smart Insights members on the call today. So I just want to make you aware, if you haven't seen it, in our email marketing and marketing automation toolkit, we do have a detailed GDPR briefing, which is available for our premium, our individual and business members. And we've recently updated this, and it has guidance to a range of sources, including the Information Commissioner's Office and the Direct Marketing Association, and also examples of privacy policies and the approaches that some companies have given. So I'll now hand you over to Tim, and is it time to panic, Tim?
Well, let's hope not, Dave, but that seems to be something that seems to be happening sort of quite a lot at the moment. Even though the regulation has been around now for almost 2 years, and it's taken a considerable amount of time before that sort of to go through the EU itself. So it's quite a surprise. It's been left to the last minute by a lot of businesses to attempt to comply. There has been lots of time to prepare. I mean, Christopher Graham, the former ICO, said a couple of years ago, if you're doing all you need to do under Data Protection Act 1998, you don't have that far to go to be GDPR ready. Now, there is loads of advice out there, but as you alluded to, not all of it's very good. It's difficult to know who to listen to with so many conflicting opinions as well. So let's take a look at what we're going to be covering. We're going to be looking at what is personal data and special categories of data, what the lawful basis for marketing is, consent, what it is, and almost as important, what it isn't, PECA, or Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, which is vitally important when you're planning your GDPR compliance, legitimate interests, can you use it? Why not? Balancing tests, privacy impact assessments, profiling, we'll take a look at B2B as well, and I found some good bits about GDPR, I think. So a bit about me. I've been involved in data protection and privacy since 2010. I'm the compliance director for RedEye. I hold a postgraduate certificate in data protection law and information governance. I'm a BCS certified data protection practitioner, and I'm the chair of the Direct Marketing Association's GDPR task force. And just to give you a bit of background to RedEye, and sort of put it all into context really. We deliver improved conversion and ROI through marketing automation technology and conversion rate optimization services. RedEye's proprietary technology uses data from the web, transactions, multiple customer touch points, which are combined in a single platform to deliver multi-channel marketing communications via the web, email, social media, direct mail, and mobile. So we use profiling, tracking, analysis, and predictive modeling in our solution. So data protection and privacy has been important to us for quite a long time. So important bits. This isn't legal advice. If you need legal advice, you need to go and see a solicitor. So this is really broad-based practitioner guidance drawn from ICO publications, DMA guidance, and Article 29 Working Party guidance. So for people who aren't familiar with who the Article 29 Working Party actually is it's a group of all of the data protection regulators throughout Europe. And what they decide is, between them, is how to interpret the law. So what they do is they create opinions on the law. And that's one of the reasons why it's been very difficult for people like the ICO and the Direct Marketing Association to necessarily give advice about a lot of this, about the regulation itself. Primarily because until this Article 29 Working Party has given their advice, given their opinion, the different regulators can't go out and write their own local advice or guidance. And yeah, that's been one of a very big difficulty really. So my best advice is be cautious, document your decisions, cite your references as well. It's unlikely you'll be caught out by genuinely trying to do the right thing. Data protection is a complex subject. I mean, the absence of case law and GDPR makes giving advice difficult as well. Knowledge of the subject requires a great deal of reading, study, input from all industry organisations and the regulator. But I'm glad to say there's now lots more authoritative advice from the regulator and the industry organisations as well. So before we start, a bit of housekeeping. A recording for the webinar will be sent via email. Slides will be available via Smart Insights SlideShare. Please do get involved with the interactions. Give your views in the votes and do ask questions at any point via the questions panel. So, what does the GDPR cover? GDPR is quite specific about what personal data actually is. The scope has broadened considerably. So, let's take a look at now what the GDPR actually covers. Personal data is any information relating to an identifiable person who can be directly or indirectly identified, in particular by reference to an identifier. Okay, and that's from the ICO. The scope of personal data is broad, and the reason for that is that so it can adapt to include new ways and types of personal data collected or created. As new technology is created and novel ways of using it are found. I mean, at the moment, the most popular pieces of personal data, it's name, email address, ID numbers, cookies, IP addresses, yes, IP addresses, are personal data. I know there's a bit of controversy over that, but yeah, it has been confirmed that was what the law required. IP addresses are personal data. Profile information about the people as well, that's all their personal data too. Segments they belong to, location data is personal data, and things like logs of website visits. So even if the data is in separate systems that don't identify a person unless the data is combined, that's still personal data. The definition is very inclusive. So let's take another look at some data, special categories of data. Now they've replaced what used to be called sensitive personal data. Now, special categories of data are more sensitive, so it needs more protection. Now, processing of special categories of data is generally prohibited. So you've got things like race, ethnic origin, politics, religion, trade union membership, genetics, biometrics, health, sex life, or sexual orientation. All types of data that, if they're processed incorrectly, they could do real harm to the individual. And the other thing about special categories of data, it's important to ensure that this is not being processed inadvertently. You can process special categories of data, though, under explicit consent. So, lawful basis. You need one if you want to process personal data. You need to have a legal basis of processing personal data or special categories of data. So they are consent, performance of a contract, legal compliance, protection of vital interests of a person, public interest or official authority, and legitimate interest. Now, each of those legal bases has certain qualifying criteria. For marketing, the two most appropriate bases are consent and legitimate interest. Now, you must have a legal basis, remember, for the processing to be a lawful one, and it also needs to be documented. So moving forward, one of the important things for marketers is going to be, especially when they're creating new types of processing, is that needs to be one of the first questions you're going to ask, is what is my lawful basis for doing this processing? So let's talk about consent for marketing first. What consent is, what does valid consent need? If consent is too difficult, what can you do? And what about e-privacy? And why GDPR has led many businesses to reconsent under a completely different law? Well, yeah, it's all about consent, isn't it? Let's face it, that's all we've been seeing. Presentations, emails, webinars. Consent seems to be the most popular answer to most questions in GDPR. I mean, sometimes it is appropriate, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's not. All legal bases have the same weight. Consent is no higher than any of the other legal bases. There are 6 legal reasons to cover all of the lawful reasons for processing PI. So what is consent then? Well, it's any freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes by which he or she, by statement or by clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. That is a bit of a mouthful. Now, the ICO states that the GDPR set a high standard for consent, and you have to ensure that your consent is valid if challenged, and you need to be able to prove it. So what is valid consent? To be informed, enough information must be available at the time the data is collected. Now, this can be in a layered privacy policy, but you still need enough information clearly available at the time to be considered to be informed. So important information shouldn't be hidden away in a privacy policy. If you're relying on consent, it's got to be very upfront. The detail goes into the lower layers, but not the key points. And consent means offering individuals real choice and control. Genuine consent should put individuals in charge and build trust and engagement. So you need to check your consent practices and your existing consents. Refresh your consents if they don't meet the GDPR standard. And consent requires a positive opt-in. Don't use pre-tick boxes or any other method of default consent because that will not be valid. Explicit consent, if you're processing special categories of data, requires consent separate from other terms, and it has to be a very specific statement of consent. And keep your consent request separate from other terms and conditions. Be specific and granular so that you get separate consent for separate things. Vague or blanket consent is not enough. So the more things you're trying to pull into a consent statement, the more generic you're trying to make it, the less likely that consent is going to be valid. If you've got any third-party controllers who rely on that consent, you need to name them and make it easy for people to withdraw it too. Keep evidence of consent, who, when, how, and what you've told people. If changes are made to your processing activities, you might need new consent. And that's one of the elements of consent, is that because it's very specific and because it's very informed, the chances are if new types of processing are identified that you want to do, it's likely you won't have the consent or the permission to do that. You should also avoid making consent a precondition of the service, such as brochure downloads, for example. Although consent itself might not be the most appropriate legal basis for that. And remember, consent can be as subjective as any other legal basis. How much information do you need up front for it to be informed? How specific do you need it to be properly specified? So what if consent is too difficult to achieve? What are your options? You're looking at it and saying, well, I do all of this stuff under my data processing, I'll do this profiling, I'll do all of the targeting, I use social media. Can I imagine how many different types of tick boxes I'm going to have? What if it's looking very tricky? Because it does set a very high standard. It's not just the tick box. You won't often need consent. This is the case. If consent looks difficult, look for a different lawful basis. Look for another basis that actually works and you can achieve. Because as Dave said earlier, the impact of choosing the wrong basis could be a loss of up to 80% of your marketing database in reconsenting campaigns. And because the legal basis is so difficult to achieve, that consent achieved might be invalid anyway. It's tough, to be informed enough and specific enough to be valid if you've chosen the wrong legal basis. And remember, GDPR is not the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations. That's something different. So let's have a chat about e-privacy, Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations. It's called lots of things, PECA for short. GDPR is not about permission to send electronic marketing. Electronic marketing needs to be compliant with GDPR and Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations, so not one or the other, but both. Segmentation, profiling, targeting is not strictly necessary to send email marketing, SMS, or social media campaigns. So you need another legal basis under GDPR. Just because you've got a tick box for electronic marketing doesn't make you GDPR ready. Many brands have undertaken reconsenting campaigns which will get them great consent to send email. But I'm not really sure how much more than that. So this is probably one of the most popular questions I get asked on a regular basis. Do I really need to consent my database? And if you look at the numbers, when you look at the implications of needing to do that, then it's quite a viable question. You see, there may be no need to reconsent your database if there's no requirement for consent to that processing under GDPR. Now, the Article 29 Working Party have actually given some advice about this. So they've said, if a controller finds that the consent previously obtained under the old legislation will not meet the standard of GDPR consent, then controllers must assess whether the processing may be based on a different lawful basis, taking into account the conditions set by the GDPR. However, This is a one-off situation as controllers are moving from applying the directive to applying GDPR. Under GDPR, it is not possible to swap between one lawful basis or another. I mean, when marketers have been asking for advice, this is what they should have been told to start with. So the answer might be that you don't need to reconsent your database. You've still got 1 month to go to choose your legal basis and action any campaigns. So, electronic marketing, does that need consent? Well, not always. If the contact details that you've collected meet these requirements, so there's been gathered during the process of the sale or in the context of the sale or in the process of negotiation of goods or services. So you have that relevant relationship. And the marketing relates to similar goods or services that you're going to sort of send in the future. So the process is in context and it's going to be expected by the individual. The individual was given the opportunity to opt out at the time, so they've been given the opportunity to object. And they've been given the opportunity to opt out ever since. So this isn't going to disappear under GDPR. And this does not disappear under ePrivacy 2 either. So, getting back to the GDPR, can you use another lawful basis? If you're not going to use consent, what can you use? And how do you decide what you need to document to make your decisions valid? So moving away from privacy and electronic communication regulations for the moment, back to GDPR, let's talk about privacy impact assessments, balancing tests, and how legitimate interest can actually be used. Privacy impact assessments, first of all, very important. Decisions related to the most appropriate lawful basis should only be made once a detailed audit of your marketing data processing is undertaken. If you don't know what you've got, you really don't know what legal basis you're going to need. I mean, templates for these privacy impact assessments are available from the Data Protection Network, Information Commissionaire's Office, the DMA. And the DMA's one, it's about to be released and it has a far more focused template on marketing. So that's going to be very useful. You need to check the different processing that you're doing for marketing. Are you collecting more data than is necessary for the marketing that you're doing? What profiling do you do? Do you do social media? Once you have this information, you'll be able to undertake a privacy impact assessment on that processing. Now, privacy impact assessments are undertaken on the processing to determine privacy risks to the individuals. That's not necessarily the same as risks to the business. So a privacy impact assessment shouldn't contain how much you're likely to get fined if you go ahead and do the campaign. That's something different. You need to be looking at what the risk is to the person. The process of the assessment should be documented to show you how you came to any decisions. And that is very important because if you're challenged in the future, then you need to be able to go back and justify why you chose this particular basis. So you've gone through that, and if the risk to the individuals is low, you might be able to use legitimate interest. So what is legitimate interest? What is LI processing? So legitimate interest is processing that's necessary for the purpose of the legitimate interests pursued by the controller or a third party, except where such interests are overridden by the interests, rights or freedoms of the data subject. Now, recital 47 in the GDPR actually says that the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for a legitimate interest. So there you go, marketers, you've got that big tick. I've heard numerous times where people are trying to do the balancing test and they say we're still trying to decide whether or not we can actually say marketing is a legitimate interest of the business and whether it's necessary. The GDPR actually gives you that opportunity. So it actually does say that direct marketing may be carried out as a legitimate interest. But it's not an automatic legal basis for processing marketing data. Marketing is necessary, but is what you're doing unbalanced against the individual? You still need to undertake the balancing test. where you'll be balance the impact of the processing you're doing against the rights and freedoms of the person. So let's look at balancing tests. Marketing is a legitimate interest of the data control, but is that processing necessary for that direct marketing? Are you processing data you don't really need? Is any third-party processing necessary for the purpose of the direct marketing? Is there another way of achieving your legitimate interest? And very important, would the individual reasonably expect that type of processing? And this is often down to the context, actual context of the data collection. Is the processing relevant to your relationship with the individual? Are you processing the minimum personal data required to meet your needs? And we all know sometimes it's quite tempting to get more than is needed, just in case you might need it in the future. But that's no longer valid. And to be truthful, under the Data Protection Act 1998, that really wasn't valid either. So you need to focus now on don't collect something that you're not going to need. And is the processing likely to harm or disadvantage the individual? As I said in the slide there, what type of marketing are you doing? But watch out for processing that leads to special categories of data through profiling. So after going through all of that, if the legitimate interest still looks possible, how do you use it? How do you actually make that work? So when you collect the data, the right to object must be explicitly stated. It must be prominently displayed, and it's easy to exercise that right. You must collect the minimum data necessary and delete records after use. Record your valid reason to process the individual's data, personal data, using your legal legitimate interests. And remember, the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for a legitimate interest under Recital 47. One other important part about using legitimate interest is the information that you provide people in your privacy notice. So up front, you're telling them that you're going to be using that data for the purposes of direct marketing. You're going to tell them that they can object. But it's just as important for you to be very transparent and upfront about what you're doing with the data behind the scenes. So the privacy notice itself won't just be about marketing. So it's important all of the marketing information is added in. So you've got to explain why you need an individual's personal data. You've done the audit. You now know what processing you're doing. Explain what data you hold about people and why do you hold that personal information? And where do you get all that personal information from? For example, social media. What profiling is done on the personal information and what is the purpose of that profiling? And use a layered privacy notice and privacy policy as recommended by the ICO, because it's going to make it far easier for people to understand. Far easier for people to find the answers to the questions they've got as well, if it's based on more of a layered approach, rather than just being presented with a great mass of words that they have to sort of pick their way through. Under GDPR, that type of mass wording privacy policies would no longer be valid for any of the privacy notices. Try to ensure you're not doing any hidden processing. Ensure you're including all of your profile, analysis, tracking. Transparency is a key part of GDPR, and your privacy notice is a really important place. You'll also get less complaints and look more like the good guy as well. So another popular question, profiling. Is profiling caught under GDPR? Is what I'm doing profiling? So let's go through that. I'll start by actually looking at the definition of profiling under the regulation. So profiling is any form of automated processing of personal data consisting of the use of personal data to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to a natural person. In particular, to analyse or predict aspects concerning that natural person's performance at work, economic situation, health, personal preferences, that sounds like marketing, interests, that's definitely marketing, reliability, probably not marketing, behaviour, and locational movements, again, which is likely to be used for marketing. So for us, the keywords are personal preferences, interest, behaviour, and location. So that looks like most modern marketing, especially the marketing that's done online, involves some sort of profiling. Depending upon the context, profiling can also be quite intrusive, especially if it includes types of online tracking that's likely to be unexpected. So let's look at a profiling example. This is quite a typical one, actually. It's used to make sure the content of marketing and some web pages are made relevant to the recipient. So an airline studies the behaviour of its online customers. It examines what they search for, look at how much time they spend considering each destination. This data will be combined with the location, the route the customer is most likely to use based on the previous flight history. The profile will then be used to serve the customer with a marketing communication that highlights the destination and route they are most likely to be interested in. So it's used to create more one-to-one targeting for the person. It makes campaigns more effective as well. And with things like email and SMS, it takes us further away from the spam. So in this instance, all the tracking, analysis and profiling is in the context of what the individual is doing and where they're doing it. So this is more likely to be undertaken under legitimate interest. So let's look at personal data in profiling itself. As soon as we start a profile, we're creating new personal data that relates to the individual. This profile could include many data sources. It could be website search history, browsing history, customer relationships and buying habits, credit card, store card, transactional history, credit scoring even, complaints, feedback or inquiries, their location, maybe life cycle habits that you may have been getting from third parties, social media and property ownership. Now some of the use of this data might be expected and relevant, and some might not. Context is always important. And we have to think about special categories of data in this as well. As I alluded to earlier, you can create and infer special categories of data simply by your processing of normal, non-special category data, and it can trip you up. For example, profiling food consumption or musical taste might lead to the inference of ethnic origin or religion. If you infer special categories of data, the profiling may be prohibited without explicit consent. This is why it's important to undertake a privacy impact assessment whenever any new privacy activity, processing activity, is actually undertaken. If privacy risks are identified, you might be able to mitigate those risks by changing the process or by using a more appropriate legal basis, such as explicit consent. So let's look at how profiling could be a legitimate interest. Now, is it a legitimate interest? Does it need consent? Well, it's possible that much of profiling that's done for marketing can be undertaken using legitimate interest. This is because it's unlikely to cause a legal or significant effect on the individual. Now, the Article 29 Working Party says, profiling is allowed if it is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interests pursued by the controller or by a third party. However, Article 6 does not automatically apply just because the controller has a legitimate interest. So the balancing test still needs to be undertaken. You must still consider the key elements: context, expectation, relevance, and impact. And that's the impact to the individual. But when can profiling have a significant effect? I mean, when does it maybe need consent? Because it's also possible for profiling to stray into the realms of having a significant effect. The ICO has cited some research that shows that it's possible for harm or significant effect to be caused by profiling. The Ohio State University found that behaviourally targeted adverts can have psychological consequences and affect individuals' self-perception. For example, if individuals believe that they receive advertising as a result of their online behaviour, an advert for diet products and gym membership might spur them into joining an exercise class and improve their fitness levels. Conversely, it may make them feel that they are unhealthy or need to lose weight. This could potentially lead to feelings of low self-esteem, so it's having a real negative impact on the individual. Profiling makes ads more effective and have greater impact on people. And this was one of the key concerns about the issues with Cambridge Analytica's use of Facebook data, where hidden profiling has allegedly been used to influence voting preferences. So let's take a look at the impact of B2B. There is slight difference. For example, Tim.Rowe at RedEye.com has been personal data since 1998, and the GDPR covers personal data. All businesses, B2B and B2C, will need to choose the most appropriate legal basis for their processing. If it's marketing related, it's likely to be either consent or legitimate interest. But what are the main differences between what happens now and GDPR? B2B will still need to use privacy impact assessments to see if the data processing is legitimate interest or whether it needs consent. Context will be very important in the assessment. Where did you get the data? Was the data made available by the data subject for the purpose you're using it for? Whenever personal data is captured, that is going to be used in marketing. You must prominently inform the data subject that you'll be using the data in this way and telling them that they can object. And if you are obtaining data from a third party, you must contact the data subjects within 30 days to tell them that you have their data and again, give them the opportunity to object. So it seems under GDPR for B2B, there may be more transparency than what was required before. I mean, there's no secret that business-to-business data lists, for example, went from person to person. You really didn't know where your data was. Under GDPR, that's no longer going to be a viable proposition. But it's still possible to reuse B2B third-party data. It's still possible to collect it. It's still possible to buy it and to use it. You've just got to make sure that you're sticking to the regulations. Now, B2B electronic marketing, email, SMS, that's not caught under the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations, but there is a chance that it might be caught under the e-privacy regulations that are on their way through the EU now. And that means they will apply the same as business to consumer. That might mean you need consent. So, is it all doom and gloom? Is this the end of the fun and games that we've been having in marketing? Is the data protection officer also going to become the sales prevention officer? Let's look at some great bits about GDPR. So GDPR gives rights and protections to individuals. It is a positive step for people. The law has been created to protect people and to ensure our technology and developments serve mankind and not harm it. And we are all people. So we should be happy about this law. I mean, it is protecting us. The GDPR is an opportunity to build trust. Transparency will build trust. The GDPR demands that firms become more transparent in their dealings with people's personal data. Transparency and trust could become a key differentiator in business relationships. Transparency could become a key element used to build relationships with our customers. It will become another trust-building opportunity. People prefer to deal with brands they trust. And it could become more powerful than targeted campaigns and lifecycle marketing. Building real one-to-one relationships with your customer. Could the GDPR actually become the driver behind a different type of customer-centric marketing strategy? Transparency and control. On the first contact and data exchange, GDPR compliance will help break down concern with exchanging data with brands, more customers willing to open accounts rather than use the guest checkout, and ongoing control of the data the individual is sharing. Allowing the individual ongoing control should be more likely to instill confidence and foster long-term customer relationships. And GDPR could educate people in their information rights. People become less tolerant of bad practice. Businesses that do not demonstrate proper compliance with GDPR will lose the trust of the customers and find it harder to turn prospects into customers. And of course, they'll become more aware of organisations' efforts to do the right thing. Customers will start to look for the pointers of compliance, transparent statements at point of data capture, banners relating to tracking cookies, detailed privacy notices. Overall, I believe GDPR should be seen as an opportunity for business and an opportunity to build stronger and more profitable relationships with their customers. So in conclusion, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. Marketers do face some challenges under GDPR. I don't deny that. I mean, there is lots of advice now from the ICO, DMA, DPN. We're less in the dark about what needs to be done to comply. The first step is the marketing data audit. And if you haven't started yet, I suggest you start one tomorrow. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. Step through all the options and jargon for us to consider. I'm sure the listeners took a lot from it, and we've got a great number of questions which we'll get into. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, let's go straight in. Some of the questions were covered quite early, or they came quite early on. I think you've covered what legitimate interest means in practice. We've said that a work email address is considered as personal details. So I'll now go into, we'll do it from the bottom up. There's some quite specific questions which I think will be good for people to learn the specifics. So the first one is about a business hosting a data capture form for lead gen, but where the business doesn't actually store the data itself, and instead the data is sent straight to an external client. So there's two parties involved there. So the person is asking, if it's never stored by us and we can't access it, does it still need to be GDPR compliant?
Yes. I mean, all data processing activity needs to be GDPR compliant. GDPR processing activity is going to be the collection of data, storage of data, sort of the use in segmentation targeting. So if you're doing something with data, you need to be GDPR compliant.
Okay, that's fine. I would agree. It needs to be transparent when there's third parties involved. We've got so many that we'll move through these fairly swiftly. So next, there's a couple of questions about guidelines or templates available, and you did mention one that's coming from the DMA shortly. This one specifically is the way to respond to subject access requests. Is that changed by the GDPR, and are there any templates you're aware of to help with that?
Subject access requests. Under GDPR, the main change has been that you now need to do the subject access request within 1 month. Before it used to be sort of slightly more. So the amount of time you've got is different. The scope of the subject access request is still the same. Oh yes, there's also the charge as well. You won't be able to charge £10 anymore, which a lot of people believe might be potentially opening the floodgates to everybody who doesn't like your business to ask for subject access requests. But no, that's as much as a change as it's been. People.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry, we've got to step through these fairly swiftly, so
Okay.
hopefully we can answer as many as we can before the top of the hour. So there was a related one here in the sense someone was looking for a template, but in this case it was related to the balancing test. Is there anything that you're aware of for that, or perhaps can people follow up with you on LinkedIn afterwards if they've got specific questions like that?
Yes, there's two templates I'd recommend. For general use, I would recommend the template that's been created by the Data Protection Network. They've done a really good legitimate interest impact assessment template and created a very good document, very comprehensive. For more marketing related specific template, the DMA is about to release their consent and legitimate interest guidance, which not only has sort of a lot of background specifically related to marketing, it's also got a very good template in there that's going to be very clear and easy for people to use. Okay,
that's great. That's Data Protection Network seems to be a good place to go. We've got a straightforward question here. When will the slides be available on SlideShare? I've just uploaded them towards the end of the talk, so those are now available on the Smart Insights SlideShare if you Google that. Okay. Right, someone here is evaluating marketing automation software. Quite generally, I think, how does this fare under GDPR in terms of profiling and processing of personal data? I would have thought it's fairly agnostic of the type of marketing automation platform you use. Are there any concerns whether the platform's hosted in Europe or the UK as against the US? What should people be looking for when they're selecting a new automation system?
Well, I would say one of the first things is to make sure that that whatever system you're using is able to give you subject access request data. Because you're quite right, David. It's going to be the same across all marketing automation platforms. But the most important thing is be able to get the subject access request data from whatever vendor you're using.
Yes, so be able to see the whole record of communications for that individual.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, there's no problem with stuff being hosted in the States. As long as the business has signed up to the Privacy Shield, that's still a legal basis at the moment. So yeah, as long as you make sure that it's Privacy Shield, it's protecting the data in all the way it should do, like the ISO 27001 security standards. It's quite good.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions now around opt-in and how you motivate people to do that. So this listener's saying the ICO has emailed me with their guidance, which states the fact that this benefit is unavailable to those who don't sign up does not amount to a detriment for refusal. So not the easiest language to understand. But it goes on to say you must be careful not to cross the line and unfairly penalise those who refuse consent. So are you, the question, having said that preamble, is, are you aware of clients who are providing a benefit that fits the ICO guidance? Is this related to your white paper example that you mentioned, where it shouldn't be the case that you can only access a white paper if you give consent to receive communications? Is that covered there?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is. I wouldn't say it's a grey area because I hate those. It's all about how much an individual is going to be impacted. And I would sort of go back to the first part of what the ICO actually said, as sort of in this particular case. I can't remember the exact words, but it didn't have that much of an impact. And I think what the regulation is trying to do is when you're making it a condition and it's an unbalanced condition as well. So the person's actually they're really going to lose out. And I know all of the marketing stuff that we create, we believe that's terrible if people lose out. But I'm talking about sort of the proper harm and impact that you have on somebody. And they are right. I'd agree with the ICO. You've got to do that balancing test, and you've got to be able to justify. Actually, it's not going to do harm. This not having this white paper is not going to cause somebody a real enough harm for me not to be able to use the data in marketing. And I think under those circumstances, legitimate. I mean, I would argue that legitimate interest is probably the most appropriate basis for that processing.
Yes. So the next one is about opt-in, specifically related to a newsletter sign-up, very common, of course. So does there have to be an opt-in related to that, I guess a tick box, or is it sufficient just to enter the email address, plus there's the wording around that form or that light box that they will get relevant communications?
Yeah, I think it's really quite easy. So we're talking about PECA and we're talking about GDPR here. So you've got your newsletter sign-up box. Somebody enters their email address. Yes, send me email marketing, press submit. So you've got the affirmative action. If you're doing any other stuff behind the scenes, though, you need to really sort of tell them about it. And if you've done your privacy impact assessment and decided that you can process all the other data, like the profiling, targeting, segmentation, under legitimate interest, all you need to do is tell them you're doing it and tell them they have the opportunity to object, and then point them towards a privacy policy. You don't have to
actually have the privacy policy in the light box alongside the opt-in and the button, which is confirming their understanding. Okay, great. So we've got a retail specific or a couple actually now. Do you have any examples from online retail where the checkout contains a mixture of lawful bases, that should be? For example, I have one client who collects telephone numbers during the checkout. Is that data isn't really required, so would they need a consent tick box for someone then to ring that individual?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, because if they're collecting data that isn't necessary for the purposes for which they're going to be using it, they can't use legitimate interest. They would need consent, and really they'd need to tell people why they were collecting that data, especially if they weren't going to be using it. It mainly you would more likely delete that from the form. You're going to be storing data that you don't need. So, yeah, you would need explicit consent for that.
Yes. Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is one, it means that the explanations you have on your forms of individual fields and why you're collecting the data become more important. One of the examples I shared with the guys dialing in while you were speaking was the AA example. That their privacy policy is very clear, and I think it's useful in that it's useful for learning about this, because it talks about legitimate interests and it gives details. But if you look as well at their data collection forms, they will explain how email specifically and phone numbers will be used. So I think that can help with the transparency there as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another one now related to abandoned baskets, and I think this is likely covered by PECR, because if you're going through a checkout process, that's during the course of negotiations or negotiations for sale. So is that a legitimate interest to do an abandoned basket follow-up email when someone's entered their email address?
Right. Now, you can't send emails to people without their consent, or unless they've gone through the soft opt-in. So if you want to send emails to anybody along the lines of sort of behavioural emails, then you need to have collected the data during the course of the sale of goods or services, which you would have done, because we're talking probably about basket abandonment emails here.
That's right.
Yeah, you would need to give them the opportunity to object to marketing. So you do need to do that. You can't just let somebody put their email address in, don't tell them you're going to be marketing to them, and then send them a marketing email after that.
But do you need to give them an explicit tick box? Because the way retailers have done this in the past to be compliant with PECA is they've explained that you might receive emails, but by hitting the submit button, that confirms that you're okay with that. Are you saying there now has to be a separate explicit opt-in to receive those email comms?
Oh, no. No, you just need to give people the opportunity to object. So the soft opt-in is still valid. It's going to be still valid after May the 25th. It's possibly still going to be valid in the new e-privacy regulation, because that particular legitimate interest is still in that regulation.
Yes. Since you mentioned e-privacy, I had a specific question on that, just from your involvement in the DMA, whether you, and talking to the ICO, are you aware when we can expect the finalised version of e-privacy? Because my understanding was that it was originally intended to coincide with GDPR on the 25th of May, but it hasn't gone through the review process yet, has it? So do we know how close we are?
Yeah, I think there's one more review to go, and that's the I think they call it the trilogue, when the sort of the council and the other two elements get together and they all have a battle over it, which is the one that's likely to be the longest. It's probably at least 12 months away.
So it sounds like months rather than weeks, certainly, maybe this year. Okay, thank you. On to, we've just got time now for two or three more. Sorry if we haven't got to yours. As I said, I'm sure Tim will be happy if you contact him via LinkedIn if yours is one of the one or two questions we don't get to. So this one's about data audits and how detailed they need to be, particularly here. Someone's looking at a complex e-commerce platform and their database table structure. Do you need to look at every data object?
I think probably what you need to do first is to decide what you would include in a subject access request. So that's probably what data.
Yeah, that's a good pragmatic approach to it. And I think the other one would be to actually think about what you would disclose in terms of the legitimate interest on the privacy notice. So going back to our AA example as well, they go into the details of how they might use social media retargeting, and they actually talk in their privacy statement about Facebook custom audiences and custom Google custom match. So anything that's related to those or on-site personalization would be needed, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing to bear in mind, I suppose, is that some of these systems are very complex. You don't need to start including data that's in temporary tables or data that's all it is a duplication of data somewhere else. So yeah, it's just more meaningful. What's meaningful personal data to that individual?
Yes. Okay, that's fine. Then we've got a third-party question here, where a telemarketing agency has said that they can't opt-in data initially. If you're working with third-party data partners, how can you be sure that data is opt-in?
I'm afraid you've got to audit it. It's the user of the data who has the responsibility of making sure that data has actually been gathered legally, and they do have the legal right to.
So you have to go through the due diligence.
Probably more so now than ever.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I think we've got a couple more. So this one's just about a subject access requests and making sure who the individual is. Not sure that's a common situation. But how do you verify who someone making a subject access request is? Can it be done through an online form, or do you actually need to contact and follow up to verify their how authentic they are?
Yeah, you do need to determine how authentic it is. You've got to make sure that it's the person who's actually asking for that data and that belongs to them. Luckily nowadays, most online identifiers are related to email address. So email validation is quite straightforward. In as much
okay, that's how you'd recommend
yeah.
to do that. So yeah, they were saying via an online form. Okay, well, we've got one more question. I think we've got time for it. What if you're actually looking to detect fraudulent activity? So I don't know whether you can see this question in the panel. It's the top one there now.
Fraudulent or fake activity. Can this be considered to harm the data subject? I've just lost it. They're exposed as using techniques to create fake, exaggerate online profile. I don't.
No, I don't fully understand that question either. So I think it's best we just say, sorry, we're not quite on top of that one. But again, follow up with Tim if you want to via LinkedIn. So that's just past the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank Tim again for presenting the explanation and guidance, answering the questions, and of course I'd like to ask thank you for your questions and attending. So we'll be back next month with another member webinar. So I guess it remains to say all the best for working through your compliance with GDPR and the upcoming e-privacy. Thank you. Anything to add, Tim?
No, only to say, thanks for listening.
Great.